There's an almost otherworldly quality to how a great house clings to its dignity, even as its foundations falter. On that bitter January evening in 1912, Griffin Hill Manor stood against the Warwickshire sky, like a gentleman holding perfect poise despite a fatal wound, erect, imposing, and tinged with tragic grandeur. Its windows glowed with warm light, defying the howling wind that swept the moors, while smoke rose from half a dozen chimneys, proclaiming that the Farrer family still upheld their grand Twelfth Night feast, though Sir Lionel Barrett surveyed the dining hall with the quiet triumph of a man who found victory in mere survival. The long oak table, etched by 3 centuries of family revelry, sagged under silver that had somehow evaded creditors and crystal that caught the firelight like trapped stars. He savored the irony that his finest performance was this annual charade, pretending the war hadn't gutted his fortune and his spirit. "More wine, Sir Lionel?" asked Mrs. Cordelia Hawthorne, the housekeeper, her voice a careful blend of deference and command, honed by years of service. At 45, she carried a contained vitality, her sharp eyes ever watchful for trouble lurking in the shadows. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne," Lionel replied, noting the slight tremble in her hand as she poured. "Though perhaps we should wait for my brother before the traditional toasts." At the mention of Godfrey Barrett, the table's chatter took on the strained politeness reserved for a family's wayward member. Young Edmund Barrett, Lionel's son and heir, shifted restlessly in his seat, his movement blending duty with barely veiled irritation. "Uncle Godfrey's always been unpredictable," Edmund said at 28, remarked, his tone practiced in neutrality. "Perhaps we needn't hold the evening hostage to his whims. Your uncle," Sir Lionel said softly, "has endured much these past years. We must make allowances." This charitable remark drew a derisive snort from Timothy Blackwood, the journalist who sat like a crow among swans, his worn tweeds a deliberate His notebook lay pointedly beside his plate, a silent threat. He'd arrived that afternoon with credentials from a London socialist paper, his demeanor suggesting he saw the entire affair as fodder for a future exposé on aristocratic decadence. "Allowances," Blackwood repeated, his voice dripping with irony. "How convenient that the wealthy can always afford such luxuries. I wonder if the families of those who died in the trenches find it so easy to make allowances for their losses." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lionel's face went pale, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension with the gentle authority of long practice. "In diffusing human folly, I think perhaps that we all make where we can and judgment where we must," said Father Brown, who had appeared at the manor's door an hour earlier, seeking shelter from the storm that was even now rattling the ancient windows. He was a small, round man whose black clerical garb made him nearly invisible in the flickering candlelight, and whose presence had somehow transformed what might have been an awkward social obligation into something approaching a genuine gathering. Theodicality lies in knowing which is which. Mr. the Septimus Crane, the antiquarian bookseller who completed their small party, looked up from his contemplation of the wine with obvious relief at this change of subject. He was a thin, nervous man with the pale complexion of one who spent too much time among dusty volumes, and his eyes shelled the perpetual worry of someone harboring secrets too dangerous to share. "Father Brown speaks wisely," Crane said, his voice barely above a whisper, "though I sometimes wonder if we ever truly know our own motives, much less those of others." Mrs. Thorne, who had been moving quietly around the table, refilling glasses, paused at this observation. "In my experience," she said carefully, "people's motives are usually simpler than they pretend and more complicated than they admit. A philosophy worthy oft confession box," Father Brown observed with a gentle smile, "though I suspect Mrs. Thorne has learned it through harder schooling than theology provides." The housekeeper's face flushed slightly, but before she could respond, Edmund Farrer was consulting his pocket watch with obvious frustration. "It's past 9 o'clock," he announced, Surely Uncle Godfrey doesn't expect us to hold dinner indefinitely. The tradition calls for the feast to begin before the stroke of 1:00, and I have business matters to discuss with him that simply cannot wait another day business. Matters? Blackwood inquired, his journalist's instincts clearly aroused on Twelfth Night. How refreshingly honest of you to acknowledge that even must bow to commercial necessity. Everything bows to necessity, Mr. Blackwood. Edmund replied coolly, the only question is whether we acknowledge it gracefully or pretend otherwise. Until circumstance force our hand. Sir Lionel rose from his chair with the deliberate dignity of a man performing a ritual whose meaning had long since been lost to him. I shall go and fetch Mibrether myself. He announced the feast cannot begin without the head of our family, and tradition demands. He stopped mid-sentence, his face registering a curious mixture of confusion and concern. The great hall had fallen silent, except for the wind outside and the crackling of the fire. But somehow that verisilence seemed to carry a weight of foreboding that pressed against them all. Like a physical presence, Father Brownwell had been quietly observing the interplay of personalities around the table now fixed, his mild gaze on their host, with an attention that was both gentle and surprisingly penetrating. He said softly, has a way of demanding more from us than we expect. Tope, perhaps we should indeed seek out Mr. Godfrey Farrer. In my experience, when people fail to appear for important occasions, there is usually a very good reason, though not always. When we are prepared to hear the little priest's words seem to hang in the air, like an unspoken prophecy, and even the wind outside appeared to pause as if listening whatever lay ahead. In the darkened corridors of Griffin Hill Manor, none could have imagined how thoroughly this night would test their understanding of tradition, justice, and the terrible weight of sins, both ancient and modern. Chapter 2. The Chapel Discovery. Chapter 2. The Chapel Discovery. Dawn came to Griffin Hill Manor, like a reluctant witness, pale and hesitant. Asaph, the very light itself, were uncertain about what it might be called upon to illuminate. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow into something that seemed and ominous, a white shroud drawn over the familiar landscape, making stringers of well-known paths and turning the ancient yew trees into brooding sentinels. Sentinel Farrer stood at great hall window, his face bearing the haggard expression of a man who had spent the night wrestling with fears could not name. His brother's chamber had been empty, the bed unslept in, and a growling certainty had settled upon the house, like the winter cold that no amount of coal could seem to vanish. The chapel, Mrs. Thorne said quietly, appearing beside him with that silent deficiency that marked her movements throughout the house. Her face was pale, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of resolution rather than mere concern. We haven't looked in the chapel yet, Sir Lionel. Mr. Godfrey has been spending a great deal of time there lately, praying, thinking, repeated. Timothy Blackwood, Hohad, emerged from the breakfast room with the predatory alertness of a journalist scenting a story. How dangerous that can be, particularly for men of conscience in times of moral reckoning. Father Brown, who had been quietly contemplating the snow-covered garden stern from his own window with the gentle attention he brought to all human mysteries, he observed mildly, is indeed a dangerous thing. It has a way of making comfortable uncomfortable, and the settled unsettled. Perhaps we shouldn't visit the chapel. The little party that made its way across the snow-covered courtyard, a curious study in contrasts. Solian walked with a measured dignitas, a man fulfilling an unpleasant duty, while Edmund followed with the impatient stride of youth, eager to have uncertainty resolved. Blackwood moved like a hunter, tracking prey, his notebook already in hand, and Mr. Crane trailed bend with the nervous steps of one who feared what might be discovered. Mrs. Thorne walked with purposeful determination, while Father Brown seemed to glide through the snow with the peaceful certainty of a man who had learned to accept whatever truths the world might reveal. The chapel of Griffin Hill had stood for centuries. Its stone walls, bearing witness to generations, of Ferris births, deaths, and the great occasions that marked the pace of family time. It was a modest building by the standards of great houses, but it possessed that peculiar atmosphere of accumulated prayer and sorrow that marks truly sacred spaces. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, which Salionel noted with a frown. Godfrey always closes the chapel door. Immured, always, he says. It keeps the sacred sepulchre from the profane. It was Edmund who pushed the door fully open, and Edmund, whose sharp intake off breath announced that their search had reached its terrible conclusion. There, before the altar, where Generous and Sephira had knelt in prayer, lay the body of Godfrey Ferrers, in an attitude that seemed both peaceful and profoundly disturbing. The dead man lay on his back, his arms crossed over his chest in the manner of medieval tomb effigies, but it was what rested upon his chest that caused even Father Brown to pause in surprise. Crust of bread, dark and coarse, had been placed over his heart, and beside it lay a small mound of salt, white as the snow. Outside, around his neck, barely visible beneath his clerical collar, ran a thin line of bruising that spoke of violence. Despoteeth, peaceful arrangement of the scene, good God, whispered Crane, his face going white as he stared at the symbols. It's the senator, the old ritual someone has performed. The sinning over poor Godfrey. Mrs. Thorne crossed herself quickly, her lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been something older and more desperate. It's not possible, she said, but her voice carried the hollow quality of trying to convince herself of something she no longer believed. The sin-eating died out generations ago. It's just superstition. Old wives to lest old, to frighten children. Apparently, Blackwood observed with grim satisfaction. Someone didn't consider it merely superstition. How perfectly medieval of the Ferris family to end their troubles with an appeal to ancient ritual. I suppose even aristocratic occasionally remember their peasant roots. That will do, Mr. Blackwood, Sir Lionel said sharply, though his voice shook with something beyond mere anger. Whatever has happened here, my brother deserves more respect than your journalistic cynicism. Father Brown had approached said body with the careful respect of one who understood both the mystery of death and the complexity of human motivation. He knelt beside Godfrey Ferrara's hissimo hands, moving with gentle precision as he examined the scene without disturbing its terrible symmetry. The senator tradition, he said quietly, was indeed a real practice in some parts of Wales, and the borderlands. A person, usually someone already condemned by society, would eat bread and salt over a corpse, symbolically taking upon themselves the sins of the deceased, ensure their peaceful passage to the next world. How wonderfully primitive, Edmond said, though his attempted likeness could not disguise the relief in his voice. Uncle Godfrey always was obsessed with old customs and forgotten rituals. Perhaps he arranged this himself, some sort of elaborate penance for imagined sins. The difficulty with that theory, Father Brown observed, rising from his examination, is that senators traditionally consumed the bread and salt. These appear to be merely placed as symbols. And then there is the matter of the bruising around his neck, which suggests that whatever sins Mr. Godfrey carried to his grave, the means of his departure was considerably more earthly than ritual would suggest. The chapel fell silent, except for the soft whisper of wind through the ancient stones. Each member of their small company seemed lost in contemplation of what they had discovered. But Father Brown noticed how differently each processed the revelation. Edmund's relief at his uncle's death, weird with concern for its implications. Blackwood scribbled notes with barely consoled excitement. Crane stared at the religious symbols with the fascination of a with a text he couldn't quite translate. Mrs. Thorne watched them all with iced hat, seemed to catalog every reaction, and Salionel stood frozen between grief and a terror he could not name. We must send for the constable, Salionel said finally, his voice carrying the hollow authority of a man performing his duty while his world crumbled around him. Whatever has happened here, it must have properly investigated. Father Brown nodded slowly, but his gaze remained fixed on the curious tableau before the altar. There was something about the careful arrangement of the scene that suggested not ancient ritual but modern. calculation, not spontaneous reach, but deliberate stagecraft. The bread and salt were positioned with almost theatrical precision and a peaceful expression on Godfrey Farrah's face seemed somehow at odds with the violence that had clearly preceded his death. As the little group began to file out of the chapel to make the necessary arrangements, Father Brown lingered for a moment longer. In his experience, murder scenes that appeared to be statements usually were, but not always the statements they seemed to make. Sumya gone to considerable trouble to arrange this particular message, and he found himself wondering whether Thiesening symbolism was meant to explain Godfrey's death or to conceal the true reason for it. The snow continued to fall outside the chapel, windows adding layer upon layer to the white shroud that covered Griffin Hill, as if nature itself were conspiring to bury the secrets that lay beneath the surface of this ancient house and its increasingly troubled family. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Confession Box. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Confession Box. There is something particularly unsettling about the way a crime scene changes once the officials have departed, leaving behind only the echo of authority and the lingering sense that truth has been catalogued without bygonders. Constable Henderson, a solid Warwickshire man with 30 years of dealing with poachers and domestic disputes, had examined the chapel with the methodical competence of someone who knew his limitations and stayed well within them. Murder disguised as ancient ritual was considerably beyond his experience, and his relief at handing the matter over to Inspector Morrison from the county seat had been almost palpable. Father Brown remained in the chapel after the others had retreated to the house to await the inspector's arrival. The little priest moved through the sacred space with the quiet reverence of one who understood thought violent death, even when cloaked in symbols, was still a profound violation of the divine order. He had seen enough of human nature to know that murder was rarely as simple as it appeared and never as complicated as people pretended. The chapel itself seemed to exhale secrets in the pale afternoon light that filtered through its ancient windows. It was a building that had accumulated the weight of centuries, where countless Farrahs had wrestled with their consciences and sought absolution for sins, both great and small. The family tomes lined the walls like silent witnesses, their marble effigies wearing expressions of stone serenity. Fact contrasted sharply with the troubled faces of their living descendants. It was while examining the small confession box tucked into an alcove near the altar that Father Brown made the first significant discovery. The wooden panel that separated penitent from priest bore scratches that were clearly recent, desperate gouges in the old oak that spoke of someone clawing at the wood in extremity of emotion. But it was what lay beneath the scratches that arrested his attention, words carved with deliberate precision. Despite the obvious distress of their author, the charity funds, the scratches read Henderson's Rest Home for Veterans. The ledger show. The message broke off abruptly, as if the carver had been interrupted or had lost the courage to continue. Fascinating reading, Father. Father Brown looked up to find Timothy Blackwood standing in the chapel doorway, his journalist instincts having drawn him back to the scene, like iron filings to a magnet. The man's eyes held that peculiar combination of satisfaction and hunger that marked those who fed another people's secrets. Reading that was probably not intended for public consumption, Father Brown replied mildly, though I suspect it was intended for someone's consumption. Blackwood approached the confession box with the careful steps of a man who sensed a story taking shape. Henderson's Rest Home, he murmured, examining the scratched words. I know that name. It was one of the charities established during the war to care for wounded veterans. There was some scandal about missing funds, though it was quietly hushed up when the war ended and everyone wanted to forget such unpleasant details. Unpleasant details, Father Brown repeated thoughtfully, have a way of refusing to stay forgotten, particularly when they involve the suffering of those who have already sacrificed so much. The sound of footsteps on the chapel's stone floor announced the arrival of Mrs. Thorne, who entered with the purposeful stride of checking that all was in order. Her face grew pale when she saw the woman examining the confession box, and her hands twisted involuntarily in the folds of her dark skirt. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "Sir Lionel has asked me to inform you that tea is being served in the library. The inspector is expected within the errand. Sir Lionel thought it best if we were all gathered together when he arrives." "How considerate of Sir Lionel," Blackwood observed, with barely concealed irony. "Though I suspect some of us might prefer to avoid such gathering, particularly if certain wartime financial arrangements are likely to come under scrutiny." Mrs. Thorne's face flushed, but her voice remained steady. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Blackwood. The war was a difficult time for everyone, and people did what they thought best under terrible circumstances." "Indeed they did," Father Brown said gently, "though I suspect the difficulty lies in distinguishing between what people thought best and what actually was best. The two are not always the same thing." As they prepared to leave the chapel, Father Brown paused at the small table where Godfrey Farrer had apparently been accustomed to read and pray. A.B. breviary lay open to the Epiphany readings, but tucked between its pages were several sheets of paper covered with Godfrey's careful handwriting. The contents proved to be notes on moral theology, but also something more practical: a detailed accounting of financial discrepancies in various wartime charities, with particular attention to Henderson's Rest Home. "Your master's brother," Father Brown observed to Mrs. Thorne, "appears to have been conducting something of a personal audit of family financial dealings during the war years." Mrs. Thorne's hands clenched more tightly, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped, enough to reveal something raw and angry beneath. "Mr. Godfrey had been troubled lately," she said. "He spent hours reading about conscience and duty and the weight of past sins. It wasn't healthy, or that brooding over things that couldn't be changed." The past, Blackwood interjected with the sharp interest of a predator sensing weakness, "has a curious way of changing when examined closely. What seems justified in wartime emergency often appears rather different when viewed from the comfortable distance. Off beside prosperity, you speak very easily of comfort, Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Thorne said, her voice taking on an edge that neither man had heard before. "But some of us know the true cost of those wartime years. Some of us lost marathon money." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession, and Father Brown found himself studying the housekeeper's face with new attention. There was grief there, old and carefully contained, but also something else, a kind of settled anger that spoke of wounds that had never properly healed. "Thus," he said quietly, "takes many forms. The difficulty lies in knowing when grief becomes something else entirely, something that demands action rather than acceptance before." Mrs. Thorne could respond. The chapel door opened again to admit Septimus Crane, the antiquarian bookseller, who had spent the morning in obvious nervous agitation. His thin face was even paler than usual, and his hand shook as he approached their small group. "I must speak with you, Father Brown," he said urgently, "about Mr. Godfrey and the books he had been purchasing from me. I fear I may have contributed to his distress of mind." "What sort of books, Mr. Crane?" Father Brown asked gently. "Theological works, primarily," Crane replied, wringing his hands, "but also historical texts about moral responsibility and the examination of conscience." He had become obsessed with the idea of public confession, of making amends for past wrongs. "I tried to dissuade him, but he was determined to follow his conscience, wherever it led." "And where was it leading him?" Blackwood inquired with obvious interest. Crane glanced nervously at Mrs. Thornabore, answering, "He intended to make a public statement about certain financial irregularities. The war years, he felt that his family's honor demanded full disclosure, regardless of the consequences to their reputation or fortune." Mrs. Thorne had gone white as chalk, but her voice when she spoke was steady. "Astone, Mr. Godfrey was a good man," she said quietly, "perhaps too good for his own sake. Sometimes conscience can be as dangerous as any enemy." Father Brown watched the interplay of expressions cross her face. Grief, anger, fear, and something else that might have been either regret or resolution. The afternoon light, slanting through theachapel windows, seemed to catch the tears that trembled in her eyes, but did not fall. As they finally left the chapel and walked across the snow-covered courtyard ward, the house, Father Brown found himself considering the curious arithmetic of human motivation. Godfrey Farrer had been preparing to expose financial misconduct that would have destroyed his family's reputation and remaining fortune. Someone had killed him before he could make that confession, using symbols that suggested ancient ritual but concealed modern calculation. The question that remained was whether the killer had acted from loyalty to the family name, fear of personnel consequence, or some deeper hunger for justice that had transformed into its opposite. The windows of Griffin Hilmanor glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, but Father Brown could not shake the feeling that somewhere within thoughts comfortable walls, someone was wrestling with the terrible knowledge of what they had done and why they had been driven to do it. Chapter 4, The Bookseller's Burden. 4. The Bookseller's Burden. The library of Griffin Hill Manor possessed that peculiar atmosphere of accumulated wisdom and accumulated dust that marks the collections of old family's volumes that had been purchased with good intentions and largely ignored with even better ones. Inspector Morrison, having arrived with a grim efficiency oath, a man accustomed to unpleasant duties, had established himself at the great mahogany desk like a judge preparing toey evidence. He was a lean, methodical man whose iron gray hair and careful manner suggested years of dealing with the complexities that arise when crime intersects with respectability. Now then, Inspector Morrison said, adjusting his spectacles with the precision of ritual, I've examined the scene, spoken with Constable Henderson, and reviewed the medical examiner's preliminary findings. Mr. Godfrey Farrar died of strangulation sometime between 11 o'clock last evening and 3 this morning. The arrangement of symbols suggests someone wished us to believe this was connected to the old Sinny-adding trade-ins, though I confess such folklore is outside my usual experience. Septimus Crane shifted nervously in his chair, his thin fingers worrying at the edges of a leather portfolio he clutched like a shield. Inspector, he said hesitantly, I fear I must burden you with information that may prove relevant to your investigation. My relationship with the deceased was more complex than mere commerce. In what way, Mr. Crane? The inspector inquired, his pencil poised over his notebook. For the past 6 months, Mr. Godfrey had been purchasing books from my shop in Stratford. Theological works, primarily, but also historical texts dealing with matters of conscience and moral responsibility, Crane explained, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject. He had become deeply interested in the concept of public confession, the duty of a Christian to acknowledge past wrongs, regardless of personal cost. Edmund Farrer, who had been standing by the window with the restless energy of a man eager to have unpleasant business concluded, turned sharply at this revelation. What sort of past wrongs? He demanded. Uncle Godfrey lived like a monk. Watson's could he possibly have needed to confess? That, I fear, was precisely the problem, Crane replied, darting a nervous glance at Salian. Mr. Godfrey had convinced himself that he bore responsibility for the actions of his family. That silence in the face of wrongdoing was itself a form of participation in sin. He spoke of making a public statement about certain financial arrangements during the war years. Sir Lionel's face had gone gray as winter. Stone financial arrangements, he repeated slowly. Septimus, surely you must understand that wartime presented impossible choices. The estate was failing, the tenants weary suffering, and the government's demands seemed designed to destroy what centuries of fairer stewardship had built. I understand perfectly, Salian, Crane said quietly. What troubled Mr. Godfrey was not the necessity of difficult decisions, but the source of the funds that eased those difficulties. Timothy Blackwood, who had been taking notes with the satisfied air of a man watching his suspicions confirmed, looked up with sharp interest. Now we approach the heart of the matter. Tell me, Mr. Crane, did Mr. Godfrey specifically mention Henderson's rest home for veterans? The book Seller's face crumpled, as if he had been struck. He did. He admitted he had discovered that funds intended for the care of wounded soldiers had been redirected to maintain the estate during its darkest period. He felt that men who had already sacrificed so much for their country had been betrayed by those they trusted to care for them. Mrs. Thorne, who had been arranging tea with mechanical precision, suddenly dropped the silver spoon she had been holding. The metallic ladder seemed to echo through the library like a judgment, and her face had taken on the pallor of old ivory. Mrs. Thorne, Father Brown observed gently, you seem distressed by this discussion. Did you perhaps know some of the men who would have benefited from Henderson's rest home? The housekeeper's hands trembled as she bent to retrieve the fallen spoon. Fiancé, she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, was wounded at the Sandale. He was promised a place at Henderson's when he returned, but she straightened, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But there was no place for him, no funds, he said. No room. He died in a charity ward in Birmingham, alone, and forgotten. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and uncomfortable. Inspector Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. I see that would indeed create a personal connection. To the matter, when did your fiancé die, Mrs. Thorne? December of 1919, she replied, her voice steady now, but hollow. 3 years of suffering, waiting for the help he'd be promised. 3 years of watching a good man waste away while she gestured helplessly at the opulent room around them, while others lived in comfort. Purchased it with his pain. Edmund stepped forward with the aggressive stance of a man defending his patrimony. Now see here, Mrs. Thorne, you cannot seriously suggest that my family was responsible for every tragedy of the war. The government made impossible demands, the economy was in ruins, and difficult choices had to be made. Uncle Godfrey understood this when the decisions were made. His recent crisis of conscience was simply the product of too much solitary brooding. Crisis of conscience, Father Brown repeated thoughtfully. Interesting phrase. Tell me, Mr. Edmund, what business matters did you need to discuss with your uncle? You mentioned them yesterday evening with some urgency. Edmund's confident manner faltered slightly. Nothing of great import, merely some papers requiring his signature for sale of a portion of the estate lands. With property values improving, it seemed an opportune moment to liquidate some assets. Assets that presumably would have been impossible to sell had your uncle proceeded with his planned confession, Blackwood observed with journalistic criticism. Nothing quite ruins property values like a public scandal involving the misappropriation of veterans' charity funds. Mr. Blackwood, Sir Lionel said with quiet dignity, whatever mistakes may have been made during those terrible years, they were made from necessity, not greed. That choice was between letting the estate fail entirely, throwing dozens of tenant families into destitution, or borrowing against funds that we fully intended to repay once circumstances improved. Intentions, Mrs. Thorne said softly, but with an edge like steel, our poor Comforto the dead. Father Brown had been quietly observing this exchange with the gentle attention he brought to all human folly, but now he spoke with a thoughtfulness that drew every eye in through. It seems to me, he said, that we have here a rather complete picture of motive. Mr. Godfrey intended to confess publicly to financial irregularities, yet would have destroyed his family's reputation and remaining wealth. His brother faced ruin. His nephew faced the loss of his inheritance, and Mrs. Thorne faced the exposure of a truth she had perhaps hoped to see acknowledged through more personal means. Mrs. Thorne's face flushed, but her voice remained controlled. What do you mean by that, Father? I mean, Father Brown replied gently, that someone who has suffered as you have might understandably wish to see justice done, even if that justice came through confession rather than accusation, but someone else might equally understandably wish to prevent such a confession, particularly if they stood to lose everything by it. Inspector Morrison nodded slowly. Indeed, the question now becomes one of opportunity and method. Mr. You mentioned that Mr. Godfrey had been reading about public confession. Did it give you any indication of when he intended to make his statement? Spoke of Epiphany as a time of revelation, Crane replied reluctantly. He felt that the feast of the showing forth of Christ to the world was an appropriate moment for his own showing forth of truth. I believe he intended to make his confession public today. The implications of this revelation settled over the room like a weight someone had killed. Godfrey, Farrer, on the very eve of his intended confession, using symbols that suggested ancient ritual but concealed modern desperation. The question that remained was which oft-assembled company had possessed both the opportunity and the resolution to commit such an act. Father Brown rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the last light of day was fading over the snow-covered downs of Griffin Hill. Somewhere in the gathering darkness lay the answer to this puzzle, but he suspected it would be found not in the physical evidence of the chapel, but in the moral landscape of men. Hearts wounded by war and twisted by the impossible choices that crisis meant of ordinary people. Chapter 5, Songs of the Dead. Chapter 5, Songs of the Dead. There is something almost archaeological about the examination of a dead man's possessions, as if each careful lip-preserved item were a fragment of pottery that might properly interpreted reveal the shape of an entire civilization. Inspector Morrison had established himself in Godfrey Farrer's modest chamber with the methodical thoroughness of a scholar, though the texts he was examining spoke not of ancient empires but of a more recent and personal reckoning with moral responsibility. The room itself bore witness to its occupant's transformation from comfortable younger son to troubled penitent, where once had stood the ordinary accumulations of a gentleman's life-hunting prince, sporting trophies, the casual debris of privilege. Now remained a narrow bed, a prie-dieu, and shelves lined with theological works, whose austere titles spoke of their owners' growing preoccupation with sin and its consequences. Inspector Morrison observed, holding up a well-worn volume, appears to have been inconstant. You see how the pages fall open naturally to certain passages about confession and penance. Father Brown accepted the offered book with the reverent care of one who understood the weight that sacred texts could acquire in troubled souls. As he turned the pages, something fluttered to the floor. A piece of paper covered with Godfrey's careful script, but not the theological notes they had grown accustomed to finding. What's this? The inspector inquired, bending to retrieve the fallen sheet. It appears Tobe, a folk song. Father Brown replied, studying the paper with growing interest, or rather verses from several folk songs, all dealing with the sin-eating tradition. Listen to this. The Siniator comes when the church bell tolls, to feast upon the dead man's souls, with for sorrow and salt, for pain the living may rest and love again. Mrs. Thorne, who had been dusting the room with mechanical efficiency, paused in her work. That's an old song from Thesp, she said quietly. My grandmother used to sing it when I was small, though she'd always cross herself after, as if saying a prayer to ward off evil. Your grandmother knew the signing customs then? Father Brown asked gently. She knew the stories, Mrs. Thorne replied, her voice taking on the distant quality of one recalling half-forgotten chilled terrors. There was an old woman in the village when I was young, someone the children whispered about. They said she had been a senator in her youth before the church put a stop to toxic practices. She lived alone on the moors, and people would cross themselves when they passed her. Cottage Timothy Blackwood looked up from his own examination of Godfrey's papers with the sharp attention of a journalist scenting a story. How remarkably convenient, he observed with characteristic irony, that Mr. Godfrey should have been studying the precise ritual used in his own murdery there. We're dealing with a killer of extraordinary cleverness, or the desideranged, his own demise, in a most theatrical manner. Septimus Crane, who had been hovering nervously in the doorway, ventured further into the room. Mr. Godfrey had indeed been asking questions about local folklore. He admitted he'd purchased several volumes on Welsh and border customs from my shop, including a rather comprehensive work on burial practices and folk magic. He seemed particularly interested in rituals involving the transference of guilt, or sin. Transference of sin, Father Brown repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that would appeal to a mendrisseling with inherited guilt. The idea that one person might take upon themselves the moral burdens of another would seem almost miraculous to someone bearing the weight of family responsibility. Morrison had been examining the handwritten verses with professional attention to detail. The handwriting is definitely Mr. Godfrey, he announced, but there are some curious variations in thank and the pressure of the pen strokes. Parts of this appear to have been copied from some other source, while other sections seem to be original composition. Father Brown studied the verses more closely, his mild eyes taking on that peculiar intensity that marked his moments of deepest concentration. How interesting, he murmured. Look here, this verse about the placement of bread and salt describes the ritual exactly as we'd found it performed over Mr. Godfrey's body. Upon the hearth the bread must lay on salt beside to catch the cry of souls departing toward the light, while Siniator banishes the night. A how-to guide for murder, Blackwood said with grim satisfaction. Written in the victim's own hand, the irony would be perfect if it weren't so macabre. Mrs. Thorne had grown visibly pale during this discussion, and her hands trembled as she continued her dusting with increasingly mechanical movements. It's not right, she said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of genuine distress. Decent eating was never meant to be used for evil purposes. It was about mercy, about helping souls find peace. And yet Father Brown observed gently, someone has used Mr. Godfrey's research into this merciful tradition to create something quite different. A crime disguised as ritual violence, clothed in the appearance of ancient custom. Edmund Farr, who had been standing by the window with obvious impatience, turned to Fossey, room with the aggressive manner of a man tired of uncertainty. This is all very fascinating from an antiquarian perspective, he said sharply, but it doesn't bring us any closer to identifying my uncle's killer. The simple fact is that someone strangled him. Anthony arranged this theatrical nonsense to confuse the investigation. On the contrary, Father Brown replied mildly, I think the theatrical element is precisely what may lead us to the truth. You see, whoever killed your uncle went to considerable trouble to make the murder appear to be something else entirely. That suggests both intimate knowledge of the sinning tradition and a strong desire to direct suspicion away from the real motive. Inspector Morrison added slowly, the killer wanted us to focus on superstition and folklore rather than examining more practical concerns like financial scandal and inheritance hazards. Precisely, Father Brown continued. But the curious thing, the ritual was performed correctly in some respects, and incorrectly in others. The bread and salt were properly positioned, but they remained untouched, which defeats the entire purpose of the ceremony. A true Ziniator would have consumed them, taking the sins upon themselves. This suggests someone who knew the forms but not the spirit of the tradition. Mrs. Thorne had been listening to this analysis with growing agitation, her composed exterior cracking like ice under pressure. Perhaps, she said in a voice that shook despite her efforts to control it, whoever did this understood the spirit all too well. Perhaps they wanted to take Mr. Godfrey's sins upon themselves, but couldn't bring themselves to complete the ritual. An interesting theory, Father Brown said thoughtfully, though it raises the question of why someone would wish to shoulder the burden of another's guilt while simultaneously silencing their confession. The room fell silent, except for the soft whisper of wind against the windows and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. In the hallway below, each person present seemed lost in contemplation of the puzzle they faced, but Father Brown noticed how differently each processed the information. Edmund sweared with relief that his uncle's intended confession had been prevented. Blackwood scribbled notes with barely concealed excitement at the story unfolding before him. Crane wrung his hands with the guiltophone, who felt responsible for enabling Godfrey's moral crisis. Mrs. Thorne stood frozen, with an expression that seemed to waver between grief and terror. And Inspector Morrison did them all, with the careful attention of a man who knew that murder, however disguised, always left traces in the human heart. As the group prepared to leave Godfrey's chamber, Father Brown lingered for a moment longer over the folk song verses. There was something about the careful transcription that troubled him, not the content itself, but the way certain Phrases had been emphasized or repeated. It was as if the copist had been trying to memorize not just the words, but the precise ritual. They described like an actor learning lines for a performance in which everything depended on getting the details exactly right. The shadows were lengthening in the corridor as they finally departed, and somewhere in the gathering darkness of Griffin Hill Manor, Father Brown suspected someone was wrestling with the terrible knowledge of what they had done and why the ancient symbols of mercy had been transformed into instruments of very modern revenge. Chapter 6. The Weight of War. Chapter 6. The Weight of War. There are certain truths that human beings can carry only so long before they become unbearable. And the afternoon light, filtering through the tall windows of Griffin Hill's drawing room, seemed to illuminate not merely the assembled company, but the weight of secrets that each had been carrying like stones in their hearts. Inspector Morrison had arranged his papers with the methodical precision of a man preparing to excavate the past, while Father Brown sat quietly in the corner, his small hands folded over his breviary, watching the interplay of guilt and fear that flickered across the faces before him. The Hendersons' rest home, Inspector Morrison announced, consulting a thick folder that had arrived by courier from the county offices. Make for illuminating reading. The institution was established in late 1917 with an initial endowment of £8,000 contributed by various wealthy families in Warwickshire as a patriotic gesture toward the care of wounded veteran Sir Lionel Ferris sat rigid in his chair, his face bearing the expression of a man watching his past rise from the grave to accuse him. Those were desperate times. Inspector, he said quietly, the estate was failing. Tenants were facing eviction, and the government's demands seemed designed to destroy everything our family had built over centuries. Indeed, the inspector continued with the relentless precision of official inquiring. By early 1918, some £5.0 of the charity's funds had been diverted. A series of carefully concealed transactions to shore up the Ferris estate finances the paperwork. Chow's considerable ingenuity in disguising the transfers. Mrs. Thorne, who had been serving tea with the mechanical efficacy of long habits, suddenly set down the silver pot with a force that sent drops splashing across the polished surface of the side table. £5.0. She repeated, her voice hollow with thewit of old grief. Do you know what £5,000 could have meant to men dying in charity wards across the Midlands? Timothy Blackwood looked up from his notes with the keen interest of a journalist who sensed the story reaching its crucial moment. Mrs. Thorne, he said with surprising gentleness, perhaps you could tell us more about your personal experience with Henderson's rest home. You mentioned yesterday that your fiancé was promised a place there. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she reached for her handkerchief, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of carefully contained anguish. James Morrison, she said slowly, he was a corporal in the Warwickshire Regiment, wounded at Passendale when shrapnel tore through his lungs. The doctors said he might recover with proper care, and the family that sponsored his unit had promised him a place at Henderson's when it opened. Morrison, Inspector Morrison, repeat us. Professional composure, slipping slightly. Any relation to Inspector Morrison here? My maiden name, she replied, dabbing at her eyes. James was me cousin, as well as my intended weed. Grown up together in the village. To marry, when he returned from France, he came back in the autumn of 1917. Full of hope about the new facility that would help him heal. Father Brown had been listening with the gentle attention he brought to all human suffering, but now he spoke with quiet sympathy. But the place was not available when he needed it. The place was not available, Mrs. Thorne confirmed, her voice growing stronger with the terrible clarity of old anger. Because the funds that should have provided his care had been quietly redirected to prevent a certain great house from losing its ancestral lands. James spent 2 years in a Birmingham charity ward, watching his lungs slowly fail while he waited for the help he'd been promised. Septimus Crane, who had been growing increasingly agitated during this recital, suddenly burst out with the desperate energy of a man who could no longer contain his guilt. I knew, Hector Reed, I knew about the financial irregularities, but I said nothing. Mr. Godfrey came to me months ago with his suspicions, and I confirmed them with records I'd obtained through antiquarian carts. I should have encouraged him to speak out immediately, but I was afraid of the scandal, afraid of Lysenkin's custom of respectable families. Edmund Farage had been standing by with mounting frustration, but now he wheeled to face the room with the aggressive stance of a cornered animal. "This is all very tragic," he said harshly, "but what's done is done. The war is over. Those who suffered are dead, and destroying what remains of our family's reputation won't bring them back to life, won't it?" Mrs. Thorne asked, with quiet intensity, "Would it at least give their suffering meaning? Would it at least acknowledge that their lives mattered as much as your precious family name?" "Lives matter," Father Brown observed gently, "but so does justice. The question before us is whether justice was served by Mr. Godfrey's intended confession, or whether someone felt compelled to seek a more personal form of accounting inspector." Morrison consulted his notes with renewed focus. "Mrs. Thorne," he said carefully, "you've been employed by the Farrer family since shortly after your fiancé's death. Given your personal connection to this tragedy, was that employment rather awkward?" The housekeeper's face flushed, but her voice remained steady. "Sir Lionel offered me the position in early 1920 after James died. He said it was out of respect for my loss, but I think he knew that I knew about the missing funds. Perhaps he thought employing me would ensure my silence, and did it?" Blackwood inquired, with journalistic directness. "For 3 years, yes," she admitted. "James was dead. Justice seemed impossible, and I needed employment. But when Mr. Godfrey began his researches, when he started talking about public confession and making amends," her voice trailed off, and she pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. Sir Lionel had grown progressively paler during this exchange, and now he spoke with the hollow dignity of a man acknowledging his own moral failure. "I never meant for anyone to die," he said quietly. "The plan was always to repay the funds. Once the estate recovered, we were buying time, not stealing charity." "Time," Mrs. Thorne said with bitter precision, "that James didn't have time, that dozens of wounded men didn't have, while they waited for care that never came." Father Brown rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the last light of the short winter day was fading over the snow-covered downs. "It seems to me," he said thoughtfully, "that have here all the elements of a very human tragedy. Desperate choices made in desperate times, good intentions corrupted by circumstance, and the terrible weight of consequences that no one fully anticipated. But knowing why a wrong was committed," Inspector Morrison observed, "doesn't excuse the commission of further wrongs to address it. Someone killed Mr. Godfrey Farage to prevent his confession, and that someone must answer for their actions." The room fell silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind in the ancient timbers of the house. Each person present seemed lost in contemplation of the moral landscape that had been revealed, a territory where patriotic duty and family loyalty had collided with individual suffering and the demands of conscience. Mrs. Thorne sat very still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the windows. The tears had stopped falling, but her face bore the expression of Simeon, who had reached the end of a very long and difficult journey. Father Brown, observing her with the gentle attention he brought to all human souls in extremity, found himself wondering whether the silence that had settled over her was the peace of resignation, or the terrible calm that comes before a final reckoning with truth. Chapter 7, The Garot and the Gospel. Chapter 7. The Garot and the Gospel. There is a particular quality to silence that precedes revelation, a moment when all the scattered pieces of human understanding suddenly arrange themselves into a pattern so clear, the tone wonders how it could ever have been missed. Father Brown had returned to the chapel after the afternoon's painful excavation of wartime guilt, and now stood before the altar where Godfrey Farrer had been found, his small hands clasped behind his back, as he contemplated the curious arithmetic of murder disguised as mercy. Inspector Morrison joined him presently, followed by the others, who seemed drawn by that inexorable human compulsion to return to the scene of tragedy, as if proximity to death might somehow yield up its secrets. The winter light, filtering through the stained glass windows, cast colored shadows across the stone floor, transforming the sacred space into something that seemed both beautiful and ominous. Father Brown, the inspector said quietly, "You've been studying this scene for some time now. Have you formed any conclusions about the technical aspects of the crime?" The little priest nodded slowly, his gaze moving from the altar to the confession box and back again. "Indeed, I have, Inspector, and I think that time has come to demonstrate exactly how Mr. Godfrey met his end, and why his killer went to such elaborate lengths to disguise the simple brutality of murder. Thorne, who had entered the chapel last, and with obvious reluctance, stood near the door as if prepared for flight. Her face was pale but composed, bearing that expression of resigned expectation that marks those who have carried a terrible secret too long. "The sin-eating ritual," Father Brown began, his voice carrying the gentle authority of long experience, "with human folly, was indeed performed over Mr. Godfrey's body, but it was performed after death, not as part of it. The bread and salt were placed with theatrical precision, but they were never meant to be consumed. They were symbols, not sacraments. A deliberate misdirection, designed to make us think of ancient superstition rather than modern murder." Timothy Blackwood had his notebook ready, sensing that the story was approaching its climax. "Then how was he actually killed?" he asked, with professional interest. Father Brown moved to the spot where the body had been discovered, his movements careful and deliberate. "Mr. Godfrey was strangled, as the medical examination confirmed, but not with Hansa. A rope. He was killed with a garrote, a thin cord, drawn tight around the throat with quick, decisive force. The killer approached from behind, wild, knelt in prayer, which explains both the absence of struggle and the peaceful expression on his face. His Lionel, whose own face had grown increasingly haggarded throughout the investigation, stepped forward with obvious distress. But who could have done such a thing, and why go to the trouble of arranging insinuating scene? The arrangement, Father Brown replied thoughtfully, was crucial to the killer's purpose. You see, whoever committed this crime possessed intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the local folklore surrounding sin. Eating. They knew that Mr. Godfrey came to the chapel each evening for private prayer, and they knew that the discovery of his body in such circumstances would direct suspicion toward supernatural or ritualistic explanations, rather than practical motives. Septimus Crane, wringing his hands with nervous energy, looked around the chapel with the haunted expression of a man seeing familiar spaces transformed by terrible knowledge. The theological books, he said, sudden life texts about conscience and confession that Mr. Godfrey had been studying. Someone used his own research against him. Precisely, Father Brown confirmed. But more than that, someone copied those folk song verses about sin eating with meticulous care, learning not just the words, but the precise ritual they described. This was not spontaneous violence, but carefully planned murder disguised as something far more mysterious. Edmund Farr had been growing increasingly agitated during this exposition, his restless energy now focused into sharp attention. "You're suggesting that someone this room planned my uncle's death in advance, studied the method of concealment, and then carried it out with cold deliberation?" "I'm suggesting," Father Brown said gently, "thought someone in this room had suffered a great wrong and found in Mr. Godfrey's intended confession an opportunity for a very personal form of justice." The sinning symbolism was not chosen randomly. It represented the killer's belief that they were taking upon themselves not Mr. Godfrey's sins, but the burden of avenging those who had died. Because of them, Mrs. Thorne stood very still by the chapel door, her hands folded at her waist and her eyes fixed on the altar. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "The God," she said slowly, "was made from a rosary cord. James gave it to me before he left for France, said the blessed beads would keep me safe until he returned. The admission fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to touch every corner of the chapel. Inspector Morrison stepped forward. With professional caution, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs. "Mrs. Thorne," he said carefully, "are you confessing to the murder of Mr. Godfrey Ferrer?" She turned to face them all with the dignity of someone who had finally set down a burden too heavy to carry any longer. "I am confessing to seeking justice for James Morrison and all three of the men who died because their care was sacrificed for the comfort of those who already had too much," she said quietly. Mr. Godfrey intended to make his public confession today to ease his own conscience, while the men he helped to kill remained forgotten in their unmarked graves. Father Brown approached her with the gentle compassion he brought to all souls in extremity. "But Mrs. Thorne," he said softly, "in seeking earthly justice through deviant symbols, haven't you corrupted both the sinning ritual was meant to offer mercy not to mask revenge?" Her composure finally cracked and tears began to flow down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I know what Tiv done to my own soul, but James deserved better than to be forgotten, and his death deserved more." Acknowledgement then, Mr. Godfrey's comfortable confession after 3 years of silent prosperity. The chapel fell silent, except for the soft sound of weeping and the distant whisper of wind through the ancient stones. Each person present seemed to wrestle with the terrible arithmetic of justice and mercy that Mrs. Thorne's confession had revealed. She had sought to honor the dead by silencing the living, to serve truth by committing murder, to find peace through violence. Inspector Morrison stepped forward to perform his duty, but his movements carried none of the satisfaction that might be expected from a case successfully concluded. The handcuffs clicked shut around Mrs. Thorne's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo off the chapel walls like a final judgment. But Father Brown found himself wondering whether the greatest tragedy lay not in Godfrey's death, but in the corruption of a good woman's soul. The weight of grief too long carried alone as they prepared to leave the chapel for the last time. The little priest paused to offer a prayer, not for solution of the mystery, which was now complete, but for the healing of the human hearts that had been broken by the terrible choices that war and its aftermath had forced upon them. Or Chapter 8, The Sin of Judgment. Chapter 8, The Sin of Judgment. There are moments in human affairs when all the careful structures of civilization seem to crumble, revealing the raw moral landscape beneath, and such a moment had settled upon the drawing room of Griffin Hill Manor, like the winter darkness that pressed against its tall windows. Mrs. Cordelia Thorne sat with her hands folded. In her lap, the handcuffs that bound her wrists, somehow less confining than the weight of confession that had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Inspector Morrison had completed the formal procedures with the grim efficiency of duty, but the real judgment, moral reckoning that would matter long after legal justice had been served was only now beginning. Father Brown had positioned himself near the fireplace, his small figure casting a long shadow in the flickering light, and when his voice carried the gentle authority of one who had spent years wrestling with the complexities of humanity and redemption. "Mrs. Thorne," he said quietly, "before Inspector Morrison takes you away, I think we should complete the story, not merely the facts of what happened, but fuller truth of why it happened and what it means for all of us who remain." She looked up at him with eyes that held both relief and a kind of terrible peace. "What more is there to say, Father? I killed Mr. Godfrey because he intended to ease his conscience, while James and the others remained forgotten. I used the rosary cord that should have been sacred, turned symbols of mercy into instruments of revenge. I have damned my own soul for the sake of earthly justice." "Perhaps," Father Brown replied thoughtfully, "but I think the damnation began, Macaria, not with your actions, but with the circumstances that drove you to them. Tell us how you came to work in this house, knowing what you knew about the charity funds." Mrs. Thorne was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the windows. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of carefully suppressed anguish. "Sir Lionel offered me the position 3 months after James died," she said slowly. I was destitute, alone, and consumed with grief and rage. He said it was out of Christian charity, but I think he suspected that I knew about the missing funds. Sir Lionel, who had aged years in the space of this single day, nodded slowly. I did suspect, he admitted, with the hollow dignity of a man acknowledging his own moral failure. Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Thorne, had made inquiries about the charity funds, had asked difficult questions. I thought he thought that employing her might ensure her silence, while also providing for her welfare. Comfortable arrangement, Timothy. Blackwood observed with bitter irony that served everyone's interests, except those of the dead. But comfortable arrangements, Father Brown continued, have a way of Mrs. Thorne, you spent 3 years in this house, serving the family whose choice shad cost your fiancé his life. That must have been a particular kind of purgatory. She nodded, tears beginning to flow again. Every morning I dusted the silver that death had helped to preserve. Every evening I served dinner at the table, purchased with his suffering. It told myself I was doing my Christian duty, turning the other cheek. But danger grew like a cancer in my heart. Septimus Crane, who had been listening with the horrified fascination of one who recognized his own complicitous dit forward with obvious distress. If I had not provided those theological books, if I had not confirmed Mr. Tu Godfrey's suspicions about the charity funds, and the truth would have remained buried, Father Brown interrupted gently, and Mrs. Thorne's suffering would have continued without even the bitter satisfaction. Of acknowledgement, Mr. Crane, you enabled Mr. Godfrey's awakening of conscience that was not a sin, but a service to truth. Edmund Farrer, whose own moral universe had been thoroughly shaken by the day's revelations, found his voice at last. But surely, there were other ways to seek justice, legal channels, public inquiry, newspaper, investigation, anything other. Murder. Mrs. Thorne looked at him with something approaching pity. Legal channels for a servant to accuse her employer. Public inquiry. 3 years after the fact. Mr. Edmund, you speak from the comfort of a world that has always listened to your voice, James. Deed without anyone caring enough to investigate why the promised help never came. But murder, Inspector Morrison said quietly, is never the answer to injustice. It only creates more injustice, more suffering, more souls in need of redemption. I know, she whispered. I knew it, even as I placed the rosary cord around Mr. Godfrey's neck. But in that moment, with him kneeling there in prayer, preparing to ease his conscience, while James lay forgotten in his unmarked grave, I could not bear the thought that this comfortable confession would be the end of the matter. Father Brown moved closer, his expression one of profound compassion mixed with sorrow. Lundersting, you became a senator yourself, Mrs. Thorne, taking upon yourself not Mr. Godfrey's sins, but the terrible burden of serving justice through vengeance. But the ancient ritual was never meant to work that way. It was about mercy, not retribution. The irony, she said, with a bitter smilaze, that I understood the ritual better than Mr. Godfrey did. He copied those folk song verses to study the tradition, but I learned them at my grandmother's knee. It knew that the senator was meant to consume the bread and salt, to literally take the dead person's sins into their own body. But I could not bring myself to take Mr. Godfrey's sins upon me. I had too many of my own. Lionel had been listening to this exchange with growing anguish, and now he spoke with the broken voice of a man confronting the full consequences of his choices. Mrs. Thorne, I am more sorry than words can express for what my decisions cost you and James. If I could undo the past, but you cannot, she replied simply, and neither can I. The dead remain dead, and I have added one more to their number. Father Brown studied the assembled company with the gentle sadness of one who had seen too much of human folly and its consequences. It seems to me, he said quietly, that we have here a perfect example of how the corruption of good intentions can spread like ripples in a pond. Salian's desperate attempt to save his estate and tenants led to the betrayal of wounded veterans. Mr. Godfrey's guilty conscience led him to seek confession that came too late to help the dead. Mrs. Thorne's grief and danger led her to seek justice through murder. Each action seemed justified, toth person, taking it yet, each added to the sum of human suffering. Then, what is its answer? Edmund asked, with genuine anguish. How do we break the cycle? Of wrong, leading to greater wrong perhaps. Father Brown replied thoughtfully, by remembering that human justice, however necessary, is ours imperfect, and that the desire to set right the wrongs of the world can itself bone a kind of pride. Mrs. Thorne sought to be the agent of divine justice, but that role belongs to him far greater than any of us. Inspector Morrison rose to complete his study, but his movements were gentle as he helped Mrs. Thorne to her feet. Mrs. Thorne, he said formally, you are under arrest for the murder of Mr. Godfrey Ferrers. But I want you to note that your circumstances will be fully presented to the court as they prepare to leave Griffin. Hillmaner, Father Brown, walked beside Mrs. Thorne in the gathering darkness. Besno crunched beneath their feet, and the lights of the ancient house glowed warmly behind them. But there was a sense of ending that went beyond the close of this particular tragedy. Father, she said quietly, do you think there is forgiveness for what I've done? He was silent for a long moment before answering. I think, he said finally, that forgiveness is always possible, but it must begin with the recognition that seeking to be the instrument of God's justice is itself a form of playing God. The signing tradition understood something profound, that mercy and judgment belonged to realms beyond our own. The carriage that would take her away waited in the courtyard, its black shape stark against the white snow. As Mrs. Thorne climbed inside, Father Brown reflected on the terrible arithmetic of human justice. How the attempt to balance one wrong with another had only multiplied the sum of suffering. Somewhere in the darkness, James Morrison's spirit might find peace in the knowledge that his death had finally been acknowledged, but the price of that acknowledgement had been the corruption of the soul that loved him. Most Griffin Hillmen stood silent behind them, its windows glowing like watchful eyes in the winter night, and Father Brown found himself wondering whether the ancient house had finally seen enough of human folly, or whether new tragedies would inevitably arise from the ashes of the old. In his experience, the human heart's capacity for both good and evil was limitless, and the line between justice and vengeance remained as thin as the blade of a knife, cutting both ways with equal sharpness. Howtra, thanks for joining us for Sin Eater on Griffin Hill. Did you suspect Mrs. Thorne was driven to murder by her grief over James Morrison's death, or were you looking elsewhere for the killer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this investigation with Father Brown, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Father Brown's wisdom. The most dangerous sins are often those committed in the name of justice, and the human heart's capacity for both mercy and vengeance knows no bounds.